Part 6, Synth and Bass. In this short segment, I'm going to cover the synth and the bass, so this is what we're going to cover today. The setup is pretty simple. There's nothing too complicated going on. I've got basically two instances of SYNTH, one for the synth with some modulation here and here, which I will get into in a second, and we got the sub bass. And that's it. So let's start with the synth first. Okay, so the synth patch for the chords right here is a very simple detuned saw preset. So this is SYNTH 1 right here, one of my favorite synths of all time. I use it in basically every song. This is my go-to synth. But anyway, this is a detuned saw with two voices, and it's detuned by fifth. And by itself, without any effects, it sounds something like this. By the way, this is how you enable or disable your effects chain, by clicking on this light bulb icon. So by itself, it doesn't sound too exciting. The real magic happens in the effects. Luckily, you can create a lot of interesting textures just by messing around with rather simple parameters. So you don't need to be a sound design genius in order to make somewhat decent sounds. Sometimes automating too much just ends up in a huge mess. Okay, my approach honestly is, in 90% of cases, I pick a preset that sounds good on its own, and then I tweak it a little bit, add effects and stuff like that, and that's it. And this is what I did in this project as well. As you can see, the effects chain for the synth is pretty straightforward. There's only two plugins on it, but this is what makes the sound move in the way it does. So the first plugin is an automated low-pass filter. It's responsible for that wah-wah filter movement. Here's the automation clip, and in action, it looks and sounds something like this. I always try to make sure that the modulation or the movement of my synth isn't just random wobbles, like bop, 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 but actually contribute to the groove rhythmically, right? And this is going to depend on the drum pattern and the tempo of the track, so this is going to vary from project to project. Just keep in mind that you need to be aware that a modulation like this can create a new rhythmic element that needs to be dealt with. Anyway, as you can see, the modulation stays pretty much constant throughout the track, except for this part right here. And what happens there is that the filter opens up right before the next section of the song to create some sort of tension. Check this out. So before that next section starts, I want to sort of prepare the listener that some change is about to happen. And using automation like that can help to make more interesting transitions or create more tension within your transitions, within your songs, and more dynamics in general. And the filter never opens up completely though, because I need that top end space for the vocal chops. So again, this is going back to mixing, going back to the idea of context and contrast. So the synth is really muffled with a lot of mid-range, but no top end at all, because some other elements are taking care of that frequency range, right? So if there wasn't such an emphasis on the vocal chops in this song, I might have opened the synth up more, but I don't need those frequencies in this context. Okay. All right, the second plugin is another low-pass filter automation, but this is a little different. It opens up very slowly over a longer time period, and this is used for the intro. I wanted to introduce or foreshadow that synth with its movement already, but without revealing the full range of the synth right away. Honestly, I could have done it with one automation, but I went for the quick and lazy fix. Not that there's anything wrong with that, as long as you remember what you're doing, but it can get messy if you just slap on filters upon filters, because they're gonna interact with each other, obviously. So keeping it as simple as possible is always good, but sometimes, you just go for the quick thing. And finally, there is a tiny pitch bend just to add a little extra texture. I personally prefer to do my pitch bends with an automation clip rather than hard code it into the synth, so to speak, because I don't want to trigger the pitch bend every time a note plays. I want more control, and the automation clip gives me that control over my patch. Okay, so that would be the synth for you. Let's continue with the chords. The chord progression in King of Thebes is rather simple. To be quite frank, I don't know enough about music theory to tell you exactly what's going on, you know, with the Roman numerals and stuff like that, but I can show you how I build my chords usually. So the way I build my chord progressions is to start with single notes like this. So that would be the root notes of the chords, I guess, I think, I don't know. And once I got this foundation, I stack notes on top of each other until it sounds pleasant to me. I don't know, I just use my ears and feel it out. There's probably smarter ways to do this, but this is how I do it. I'm not sure if I'm actually incompetent or just unable to articulate what I'm doing, but hey, it works. I usually program the bass after I'm happy with the chords. What I would do is to take the root note from the chord progression and then see if that works for my bass line. So in this case, the bass line just follows whatever the synth is doing. I also like to add some notes 1 octave up to make the bass line a little bit more bouncy, you know, to get that whoop effect. That way, it just has a little bit more movement. And the way I did it here is to enable the mono legato in SYNTH, which means one note is going to transition into the next note gradually. And the portamento setting is the time it takes to get from one pitch to the next. So in this case, this would be a rather fast setting. So it's not a, but it's a, and then I draw a little note 1 octave up. Super easy. As far as effects go, there's some saturation that barely does anything, and a low pass filter. Why? Because I like to use a low pass saw as my sub bass rather than a simple sine wave, because it fills some of the space in the lower mids, but it's pretty close to a sine wave anyway, so this is just a tiny trick, I guess. By the way, you can download both of those SYNTH presets for free if you like. The link is in the description. Okay, so that would be it for the synth and the sub. See you next time when we talk about mixing and mastering.